Link's Awakening was a game that I always wanted to love. With its charming characters, the phenomenal story, and brilliantly designed overworld and dungeons, it unfortunately brought out the limitations of the Game Boy hardware. They really didn't design this game around having to use only 2 buttons, which led to the entire game feeling like Ocarina of Time's Water Temple with how many times you need to open your inventory to swap items. It really put me off from playing it that often, and it did put a damper on my enjoyment overall. Even the Oracle games weren't this obnoxious despite sharing a few of these issues. So imagine how excited I was when the 2019 February Nintendo Direct ended with the announcement of a remake of the game. Finally, they were making a version of the game that I could actually enjoy without having to deal with the limited control scheme of its original release. All this to say that for this retrospective, I played the Switch remake of the game, and everything I have to say about it is based on the remake. So before we get into this brilliant game proper, let's talk about the remake and how its differences affected my thoughts of the game. Josh the Camera Goose Link's Awakening Retrospective begins now. Much like Skyward Sword HD, the remake's biggest strength is bringing out the best qualities of the game by removing the biggest barriers for me. That game did so by minimizing Vi's presence, adding camera controls, and just generally improving the pacing. Link's Awakening does something similar, though its differences feel a lot more substantial. First off, they made items like the Power Bracelet something that no longer needs to be equipped, which is an absolute godsend considering how many times you need to use it. I'm not really sure why they didn't do this for Rock's Feather, since that's also one of the most used items in the game, but it's not a huge issue. It's much easier for me to focus on exploration or puzzle solving and to play for longer periods of time due to its improvements. There are a few other things that the remake adds, like more heart containers and other such goodies, which makes Koholint feel a lot denser than in the original, and personally I think that this is a good change. More things to do in the world will generally always be a good thing in my book. It doesn't harm progression in any way, it merely adds more exploration into the equation. Arguably, the biggest thing that the remake adds to the game is a dungeon remixer. While cool in concept, it's mostly just a distraction. Hearing that the reason there's no Zelda Maker in the vein of Mario Maker being that coming up with puzzles is hard, hence what they went with in this game, is kind of dumb. Making good platforming levels is also hard, yet that didn't stop the existence of Mario Maker. Not to disrespect the Zelda team, they are arguably one of the best set of developers in the world and have made over a dozen of my favorite games of all time. But I don't really think that the average consumer not having a good grasp on puzzle design is all that convincing. It feels more like an excuse to not make the game rather than just saying, I don't really want there to be a Zelda Maker. In an interview, Aonuma said that if the reception to remixing rooms was positive, then it would be something that they kept in mind for the future, and to be honest, I'm not really sure if another game having a side mode like this or a full game dedicated to just remixing different rooms would be all that great. There's just not that much that you could really do with the concept. Pre-made rooms just aren't flexible enough to do anything really interesting. Perhaps if you could use pre-made rooms and layouts and then remix it from there on top of being able to create your own would be a good way to go about it, but who knows how well that would actually work in practice. The reason I went on that tangent is because it highlights my biggest problem with the dungeon remixer in this game. It's just not that fleshed out or interesting. The idea of making your very own dungeon is a compelling concept, and remixing a dungeon using rooms you've already visited also feels like a decent way of streamlining the process. But it's not like you can add or take stuff out of those rooms, which takes a lot of the creativity out of the experience. Plus, there really isn't that much of an incentive to really play with it outside of the few rewards you get, since there's no way to play anything other than what you've already made. Not like an online function would even be that good anyway, since there's only so many ways that you can build the same thing. In Mario Maker, making levels is pretty fun, but it's actually getting to share those levels and see what else other people have made that makes the game actually fun and interesting. It's just a side mode in the game, so I can't be too harsh on it, but I will never forgive it for most likely killing the idea of a
Zelda Maker forever.
In terms of the presentation of the remake, the visuals are kind of a mixed bag. First off, as a translation of the original pixel art, it's impossible to please everyone. Everyone has their own interpretation of how the game should look, and this remake definitely went in a very specific direction that isn't even really faithful to the original game. Personally, I really like the art style that they went with here. The Fisher-Price-esque design of the characters really emphasizes the playful side of Koholint and contrasts nicely with the depressing nature of the story that we'll get into at the end of this section. I think that the game is just really appealing to look at overall. It's really unique in comparison to any other game in the series, and for me it does enhance the experience. Compared to the original pixel art, I think that it's a fairly reasonable interpretation of the original game. Though if I did have one minor complaint, it would definitely be with the cutscenes. The cutscenes had this really cool 2D hand-drawn style that makes me wish for a Zelda anime, especially considering how surprisingly good the mangas are, but that's off topic. These cutscenes clash with the gameplay art direction pretty hard, which isn't too big a deal, almost as if Link is leaving reality and entering the dream of the windfish. But I do feel as though the opening and closing cutscenes could have been a bit more cartoony so there isn't as much whiplash, but I digress. There are two main problems that I have with the visual presentation of the game though. Firstly, the performance. The game has a hard time keeping up with its 60 FPS target, which makes me wonder why they didn't just try to target 30 FPS. While a higher frame rate is nice outside of first-person shooters or fighting games, I don't really think that higher frame rates are strictly necessary, especially for a top-down adventure game. The game does actually run basically flawlessly if you play in handheld mode, with docked mode clock speeds, but I still think that lowering the target frame rate would be a lot more reasonable. A consistent frame rate is far more important than a high frame rate. The dynamic resolution scaling is fine for the most part, though there are some points where it can get a little too blurry. For the most part, it's not too big of an issue. The second problem isn't technically that big of an issue, but it personally really bothers me, and that's how Link looks when he moves. I don't really care that you're locked to 8 directions. What I care about is that Link snaps to whatever direction you're going. Even just one frame of animation in between would go a long way in making it look better, though preferably there would be a bit more turning animation. The other animations are fairly solid and fluid, so why he just snaps from one direction to another is even stranger. It looks borderline unfinished, and it's a pretty big stain on what I think is otherwise a pretty good looking game. The music of the remake is pretty stellar, as most Zelda game soundtracks are. The original game's OST is arguably the best the Game Boy had to offer, though with how limited the sound capabilities were with the system, it meant that the actual compositions are all fairly basic, with the main melody of the track being the only thing that could bring a different flavor to each track. The original game had some really good melodies, but when the remake soundtrack came along, it blew the original game out of the water. Base Shrine is one of my favorite dungeon themes, reaching the heights of the Forest Temple and Water Temple themes from Ocarina of Time, as well as the phenomenal dungeon tracks from Skyward Sword and Breath of the Wild. It's the dungeon where the truth of the island is fully revealed rather than just being hinted at, and the track here is fittingly haunting. The rendition of the main theme is pretty solid. Sword Search is depressing since it only plays right at the start of the game. Mabe Village is one of my favorite town themes in the series. It's tied with Skyward Sword as having my favorite staff roll of any Zelda game. It is truly an excellent piece of music. Pieces like Manabo's Mambo are fittingly strange, Ballad of the Windfish is obviously brilliant, and every variant of the theme is equally as fantastic, particularly On the Beach with Marin, and the list of great tracks goes on. I love how for some tracks they remix the original chiptune pieces into it, like in the Staff Roll or Face Shrine. I also really like when they mix some synth in with the rest of the orchestra, like in the opening theme. The soundtrack has this focus on woodwind instruments, which is my favorite section of the orchestra, so perhaps that bias has something to do with my love of this rendition of the OST. Link's Awakening is a pretty weird game, and the soundtrack complements that wonderfully, and considering that the composer was originally gonna go with annoying elf voices, it makes me even more grateful of how good the final product ended up being. And then there's the story, and it's one of the best in the series if you ask me. Your main goal is to wake the windfish, but with hints at the start of the game before the reveal at the midway point in the game that everything is just a dream. It makes the endgame something to actively avoid, since doing so would erase Koholint from existence, effectively killing all of the residents. It's a bittersweet ending, the only one in the series that I can really think of. No other game in the series ends on such a sad note. Sure, Majora's Mask has the Deku Butler crying over his son, a reminder that just because Termina is saved, that doesn't mean that everything will suddenly be okay for the rest of time, but everyone else gets a happy ending, and throughout the game you actively look forward to the final battle with Majora, as that is what will ultimately save the residents of Termina from their suffering. In Link's Awakening though, this really isn't the case. There's this interesting dilemma that it presents. It is part of the windfish's dream, so surely everything that's a part of the world is technically property of the windfish. So if the windfish wants to be woken, does that make erasing these people from existence justified? Ultimately, it's up to the player to decide even though the answer doesn't really matter. Because no matter what, Link will eventually have to wake the windfish, whether he likes it or not. The ending hits especially hard because of Marin. She is easily the character that you get the most attached to. She's the first person you meet, you have to save her from monsters at one point in order to access the next dungeon. There's a heart-on-heart on the beach. She develops a bit of a crush on Link, which makes the moment where the entire island disappears really sting. If you don't die at all in your playthrough, then you'll get a secret ending where Marin lives on as a seagull, which I don't personally like as much as the regular ending, since it alleviates some of the weight the ending carries with it. I particularly like the imagery at the end of Link sitting on his broken raft in the middle of the ocean before seeing the sight of the windfish, which lifts his spirit. It doesn't take away the punch the ending had, but it leaves the game on a somewhat hopeful note. It isn't just the story that's great, the gameplay is also pretty spectacular, so let's get into it. Link's Awakening is a short game. In fact, I'd say that the majority of the playtime is spent on the dungeons, though we'll discuss those in the next section of the video. Despite the short runtime, the game manages to deliver a pretty strong Zelda experience, made extra impressive given how this was the first real attempt at a handheld entry. One area where Link's Awakening surpasses most other Zeldas is with how well utilized the items are. Every item feels like it has some sort of use even late in the game. Magic powder is constantly used to get rid of annoying enemies and lighting torches. You constantly use Rock's Feather to jump over gaps, the Power Bracelet to lift heavy objects, Pegasus Boots to traverse the map more swiftly and to jump larger gaps with Rock's Feather, the Hook Shot being, well, the Hook Shot. Really the only items that I don't feel get that much use are the Flippers, the Power Bracelet upgrade, and the Magic Wand. The Flippers allow you to explore the water in the Overworld, though it's not like you can uncover that much that isn't required for the main story progression. I don't think that you use the upgraded Power Bracelet for that much outside of the dungeon you get it from. In that dungeon it's used pretty well, but there's rarely anything outside of the dungeon that's ever too heavy for the regular bracelets to lift, so it really isn't that satisfying to get. And the Magic Wand, being in the final dungeon, means that its general usefulness and capabilities aren't nearly as useful in comparison to the rest of the items. Still though, the fact that every item feels like it has actual value to the gameplay ultimately puts it in a league of its own. Link's Awakening is also the closest any game in the series has gotten to a Metroidvania. And the main reason as to why is due to the game forcing you to explore Koholint Island. Nearly every dungeon in the game requires you to get a key of some sort in order to access it, whether that's a literal key you need to find somewhere in the overworld, or rescuing this Chanchamp so that it can eat the obstacle obscuring the entrance. And as you explore to try and find these keys, there are a variety of areas that you will spot that have a heart piece, a cave entrance, or whatever that you can't access yet due to your lack of whatever item it is that you need to use. And it happens far more often than any other game in the series. Rushing back to that area after you get the item is immensely satisfying, and leads to a great sense of side exploration on top of the mandatory stuff. What this then means is that Koholint manages to feel more fun to play through than any of the previous 3 entries in the series, and even some of the 3D entries. Even outside of looking for the keys, the progression of the game is based around exploration, which I think makes it an interesting adaptation of the original game's design philosophy into a linear framework. It's refreshing in relation to the vast majority of entries, where you already know where you need to go, and it's more figuring out what you need to do once you get there. Here, you're given a hint as to where the next dungeon will be located, and the rest is up to you. How do you get to the region? Where in that region is the dungeon located? And once you do locate it, where do you need to go to get the key? These are the questions that you ask throughout the entire game. It could be said that Link's Awakening replaces conventional content in the world with navigation through the world, which is yet another similarity to the Metroidvania genre. That's not to say that there isn't any content in those games, just that to me the main content the game offers is a world that you slowly untangle over the course of the game, rather than items, collectibles, towns, etc. Link's Awakening is obviously not a straight up Metroidvania, there are very obvious differences, but the general design of the overworld shares obvious similarities to what I feel is the typical Metroidvania. Helping to expand the overworld exploration are the optional collectibles that do a decent job at being extrinsically and intrinsically rewarding. The heart pieces are all hidden pretty well. In the original game, there were only 12 heart pieces to find, and the remake adds 20 more, for a total of 32 heart pieces. The original 12 were hidden incredibly well, since the lower number basically forced them to hide them in devious locations. The new heart pieces are comparatively easier to find, which has a bit of a negative side effect of making those original 12 not as alluring, since maxing out the hearts is never really that big of a focus on a casual playthrough, and it's just less time consuming and brain taxing to find those ones in comparison. Secret seashells were doubled in the remake, and unlike the heart pieces, I'm not entirely sure if this was necessarily a good idea, since they didn't add more rewards, just increase the amount of seashells that you needed to get per reward. For instance, the Koholint Sword, which is basically this game's equivalent to the Master Sword, only required 20 seashells in the original game, but requires 40 in this game. And the other rewards aren't exactly great, a heart piece for 5, a sensor to find more seashells for 15, and the other 2 rewards are just tiles for the Dungeon Maker. Which is fine, I guess, but it's not enough of an extrinsic reward to make looking for them worthwhile. After a while, looking for all of them becomes a real chore, which was definitely not an issue in the original game. Before that point though, they're fine enough collectible and have decent enough intrinsic value to make it somewhat fun. If I did have one issue with the progression of Link's Awakening, it would be the trading sequence. Speaking as someone who would say that they are the bane of my existence in most Zelda games, it's actually not that bad here. Mostly because Koholint isn't quite as big as Ocarina of Time or as tedious and repetitive as Wind Waker's. Who you need to trade with is more obvious, with them making specific requests for what they want, and some moments are pretty charming. But since it needed to suck here, they decided to lock the final puzzle of the game behind it. In order to figure out how to navigate through the Windfish's egg to get to the final boss, you need to find a path in a book that is inaccessible without completing the trading sequence. And since it's random with each new game, it means that there's no choice in the matter. If you didn't go out of your way to do stuff like this, then it is very likely that you would get stuck with no idea what to do without consulting a guide of some kind. Either don't lock this information behind what initially seems like an optional side quest, or make it more obvious that you need to do the trading sequence. Considering how otherwise unobtrusive the process is, I'd honestly be fine with either approach, but the fact that they didn't do either will forever bug me. Overall though, Link's Awakening has a really strong overworld that's roots in the Metroidvania-esque design only strengthen the package. And it helps that this game has some of the best dungeons in the entire series. So let's talk about them. The dungeons in Link's Awakening exemplify everything that I love about Zelda dungeon design, and the fact that more dungeons in later games don't take similar cues from this game greatly depresses me. There are all these brilliantly designed labyrinths that are a joy to work through. Tail Cave is a fine first dungeon, I guess, teaching you about the basic mechanics, though it does kind of suffer from not living up to the soaring heights of the rest of the dungeons in the game. You can hold multiple keys, though there's not that much difficult puzzle solving they do with that. There really aren't any puzzles to speak of in the dungeon in general. Most, if not all, of the keys that you get are from enemy encounters. Even this room, with these enemies that flash different suits that you need to match, only gives you a beak that you can use to unlock hints. There just isn't much to this dungeon to talk about, so on to the next one. Bottle Grotto is a step up from Tail Cave, but not by much. I like how there's this chest in the opening room of the dungeon, and it leads to an immediate excitement for the dungeon item that will allow you to reach it later, as opposed to the previous dungeon where there was zero excitement regarding the capabilities of Rock's Feather. There's these blue and orange panels that switch whenever you hit the crystal that gets introduced here, but to be honest, there's nothing really noteworthy about it. There's this one puzzle where you have to kill these enemies in a certain way, but the hint that you get makes it far too obvious for what you need to do. I think that the strongest part of the dungeon was realizing that you need to carry a pot over your head to lower this platform since you're too light on your own. The dungeon is a bit lengthier than Tail Cave, and that leads to an overall more enjoyable time, but it's still too simplistic to get truly mentally involved. Key Cavern is where things start getting a bit more complicated. It's shaped like a giant key, and the way that it handles progression really starts making you consider how you navigate through the space, just on a smaller scale that's easier to comprehend than later dungeons. It also features a bunch of keys, having one more key than is necessary to beat the dungeon just to make it a little easier. There are a bunch of locked doors, which forces you to make choices on how you progress. And if you don't adapt to think how the game wants you to think when solving this dungeon, then you're gonna end up having a really bad time throughout the next 5. Angler's Tunnel is when the dungeons soar from good, if a little basic, to some of the greatest puzzlers in the entire series. The micro room puzzles get a bit trickier, and the macro dungeon-wide navigational puzzle starts to really ramp up. The question of how to get over to certain parts of the dungeon getting a bit harder. Getting the keys you need forces you to go through several rooms while heading to the right side of the dungeon and looping back to the previous part of the dungeon so you can finally head up. The flippers open up the dungeon way more, and there's a lot of areas that you can swim through, and so suddenly if you haven't been taking mental notes, the dungeon just got a whole lot trickier. It's still not enough to overwhelm the player at this point, but it does spell out that it only gets more complicated from here. From here, the rest of the dungeons, save for 2, just follow this pattern while making progression more complicated. Catfish's Maw expands on the backtracking, and multiple paths are opened up from the beginning, and it's the first dungeon in the game that really starts working my brain out. The Face Shrine, apart from having one of the best dungeon tracks in the series, essentially splits its main progression into 2 halves, east and west. The dungeon item here is an upgrade to your power bracelet, so naturally there are these elephant statues everywhere. There are a lot of great puzzles here, particularly with the crystals that raise and lower the blocks. It also has these chess pieces, and while I can see why some people despise them, personally I really like it. It is a little frustrating seeing it bounce seemingly at random until realizing that it probably moved in the same way that regular knights do in chess, and there you go, it works. It's a bit of an unfair problem to people who aren't familiar with chess though, and requiring outside knowledge that isn't intuitive isn't really the best way to go. Turtle Rock is the second best dungeon in the game, taking the dungeon design to its logical extreme. There are multiple paths to take right from the beginning, and unlike previous dungeons, none of them lead to an immediate dead end. They all branch out into their own distinct paths, and since there's 3 of them immediately presented to the player, it means that progression through the dungeon has to be hyper-intentional. It puts everything you've learned over the course of the game to the test, and solving it is unbelievably satisfying, in a way that I wish Zelda managed to accomplish more often. It's easily the best Turtle Rock in the entire series, and it isn't even close. Now, there are 2 dungeons that aren't designed to be these non-linear knots that you need to untangle. Eagle's Tower is easily my favorite in the game. The entire dungeon is themed around you carrying a ball through the dungeon, using it to break 4 pillars and send the upper floor crashing down into the lower one. The only complaint that I can muster is that you don't really explore that floor, so it's not like this idea that radically changes the layout of the dungeon makes it as interesting as it could have been. Also, this room where you get the ball is really annoying to go through if you lose the ball at any point. Those are the only 2 minor flaws here. There's no sequence that you have to follow when knocking the pillars down. You can do them in any order, which leads to progression being just as confusing as you would expect from a Link's Awakening dungeon. It's not as simple as just solving a puzzle or finding a key to open the door to the next room that you need the ball for. A lot of the dungeon asks you to think about how to get the ball and Link to the same location, like throwing it across a pit and then finding an alternate route that Link needs to take. There's even this one devious bombable wall that I never noticed for a while because it's either really well hidden or I'm just a blind idiot. I'll let you decide which. Hint, it's the idiot option. There's just so much to love about this one. I always look forward to replaying it on every repeat visit to the game. The Color Dungeon is the last dungeon to talk about, and it is easily the weakest dungeon to come out of Link's Awakening. It kind of feels like something they just threw in to help incentivize people to pick up the vastly superior director's cut. The puzzles are all basically solved by just seeing the color, or symbol if you're colorblind. Progression is incredibly linear, just walk into a room, solve the puzzle, then walk into the next room and solve the puzzle, rinse and repeat. I'm not too upset at its existence, mainly because it was never in the original game to begin with, but also because it does give you a legitimately useful reward of either more attack power or higher defense. It's not an unpleasant slog or anything, just unmemorable and a basic side distraction. The last thing to talk about are the bosses, and while there are a couple of standout encounters, for the most part I think that they kind of suck in this game. They're generally far too basic and short to derive any enjoyment out of them. Moldorm is so pathetically easy that it hurts. You just kind of walk out of the way and hit its tail. There is no challenge here whatsoever. Genie is also pathetic. You just walk around to avoid the fireballs, and then you throw his pot against the wall. For the second phase, you easily maneuver yourself around the bigger fireball and hit him. The game doesn't even do anything when he's swirling around with a copy of himself either, so overall, another garbage boss. Slime Eyes is more of the same. You just use the Pegasus boots to ram into it, and it's not hard at all. Is Anglerfish even supposed to do anything? Serious question, he is honestly one of the strangest bosses in any Nintendo game. You can kill him before he can even do anything fairly easily with no strategy, which almost makes me feel bad for killing him. Slime Eel is one of the few decent bosses in the game. You have to avoid his tail that moves around the arena, and you can use the hook shot to pull it out of one of these holes so you can damage him. It's still a really easy fight, but there's a bit more substance here in comparison to the vast majority of them. Facade just has you dropping bombs on his face. This is the entire fight, and he is hilariously underpowered. At least Anglerfish had a cool design. Evil Eagle is an actual good boss. In the original release, if he fell off the tower, then you'd have to redo the entire fight, which is beyond stupid. Thankfully, in the remake, they were sensible and didn't do that. You'll fly around the arena, attacking by either diving towards Link or sending a barrage of feathers or wind to try and knock you off the tower, all while you have to try and hit his beak. This makes the fight consistently engaging and fun the entire way through. Easily the best boss in the game, and it isn't even close. Hothead is whatever, just avoid the fireballs that spew out of the ground when he pops out and use the magic rod to damage him. It's not a boring fight, just an uninteresting one. The Evil Orb is a fitting end to a mediocre afterthought. Just jump and slash at him until he dies. It's not complicated or hard to fight him. So overall, he slots right in with the pantheon of Link's Awakening bosses. The Shadow Nightmares are a fitting end to the game, even if some of the phases can be quite annoying. The Giant Gel has you needing to sprinkle magic powder on him 3 times, which can be annoying sometimes, but otherwise it's not that interesting. Aghanim Shadow is basically the same fight from A Link to the Past, with you just playing energy tennis with him, and it's fine enough. Moldorm Shadow is a reference to the boss from earlier in the game, and it is literally the exact same fight, just that it takes more hits to kill now. Shadow of Ganon is similar to the first phase of the Ganon fight from A Link to the Past, just avoid his trident and projectiles that he throws at you and perform a spin attack to defeat him. Land Mola is a less effective version of the first phase of Ocarina of Time's final fight with Ganon, since your sword can't damage it, but any item that you have can do the job, and it only takes 1 hit, so there's not a whole lot to say about it. Deathel is the last form, and while it is a bit more engaging, it's still relatively easy nonetheless. Just jump over his arms and then shoot his eye with your arrows, or use the boomerang a single time. The fight is an effective gauntlet, but that's really the only standout thing about it. Despite the pitiful bosses, however, the dungeons in Link's Awakening are fantastic and truly elevate the experience of this wonderful adventure. Link's Awakening is an overall fantastic game. It's short and sweet, with charming characters, a simple yet engaging story with a real gut punch of an ending, an amazing overworld that leans more into the Metroidvania aspects of the Zelda series than any other entry, and some of the best dungeons in the entire series. Its blemishes never last for long, and the positives outweigh them so significantly that I hardly even remember them once the moment passes. Everything that I want in a 2D Zelda is here and accounted for, in a compact experience that is still a joy to revisit.